The rain had been falling for hours, a steady rhythm against the car roof. Hypnotic in a way that made my mind wander. Dangerous really when you're driving narrow country roads in the middle of the night, headlights barely cutting through the downpour. I was gripping the wheel too tight, knuckles aching. Should have eased up, but my mind wouldn't let go. The last stretch before Whitby was always like this. Dark, winding, the kind of road that makes you wonder if you're the only soul left in the world. The kind of road where things could just disappear. The call had come in earlier that afternoon. A nurse, clipped and professional, telling me my father had suffered a cardiac arrest. Serious, but not necessarily fatal. But that I should come, right now. I hadn't seen my father in years. Not really. A few Christmas cards, the occasional stilted phone call. I told myself it was better that way. But when the past calls you back, you don't get to ignore it. So here I was. The sign loomed in the rain. Whitby, 14 miles. Almost there. Almost back to a town that had never truly let go of me. Then headlights. Blinding, too bright. Someone coming the other way with the high beams on, cutting straight through into my skull. A split second of nothing but white. I jerked the wheel. The car swayed, hydroplaning for a moment before catching traction again. My pulse thundered in my ear. The other car was already gone, swallowed by the storm. I forced myself to breathe, focus. The road wasn't dangerous. I was. My mind was slipping too far into itself, and that wasn't safe. Whitby's a strange place. An old town clinging to its history like a lifeline. Tourists come for the Gothic ruins, the Dracula lore, the quaint streets. They don't see what's beneath it all. They don't feel what I feel. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe some things aren't meant to be known. I told myself this was just about my father. That I was just here to sit by his side at the hospital, say the right words, do what a son is supposed to do. But I knew better. Something was waiting for me in Whitby, and it wasn't going to let me leave so easily. The town emerged through the storm. A scattering of yellow street lights blurred by the rain. The building huddled together, dark stone facades warmed by the wind and salt. Whitby had always looked like a place that had been standing for too long, like it had learned to endure whatever time and the tide threw at it. I pulled into the hospital car park, hands stiff from gripping the wheel. The rain had eased, but the damp clung to everything, thick with the scent of seawater and wet pavement. I shut the engine off and just sat there for a moment, staring at the glow of the hospital windows. To be honest, I wasn't ready, but I was never gonna be. So I opened the door, stepped out into the cold, and walked inside. The hospital smelt like antiseptic and recycled air, the kind of artificial warmth that never quite reached your bones. The nurse at the front desk barely looked up before pointing me towards his room. Second floor, end of the hall. I stopped outside the door, fingers hovering over the handle. The beep of the heart monitor filtered through the wood. The low murmur of a television barely audible. And then his voice, hoarse, weak. "About time." I exhaled sharply and pushed open the door. My father lay in a narrow hospital bed, wires snaking across his chest. He looked smaller than I remembered. His frame diminished beneath the thin blanket, but his eyes, steel grey, sharp as ever, pinned me in place. "You look like hell," he muttered. I huffed a humorous laugh. "Right back at ya." For a moment, silence stretched between us. Not comfortable, not quite tense, just the usual space we never really knew how to fill. Then he let out a slow breath. "Doctor says I'm not dead yet." I pulled the chair closer and sat. Could have fooled me. He snorted, shaking his head. Okay, smart ass." And just like that, the tension broke. Of course, the tension was always frayed, never gone. It never could be. Not really. But at least now it was something we could sit in without it crushing us entirely. We did talk, Not about the things that mattered, mind, not about my mother or the years we lost. Instead, we stuck to safer topics. The hospital food, the nurses, the damn rain outside. Eventually his voice turned rough with exhaustion. "Are you planning on staying in town for a little bit?" I hesitated. I could leave. I should leave. But something in my gut told me otherwise. "Yeah," I said. "I've told the archives I'll be off until you get better, so I'm here until you're on the mend, alright, Dad?" He nodded, slow and satisfied as if he expected nothing else. But I felt it then, the weight, the knowing. Something was waiting for me in Whitby, and it wasn't gonna let me go. I left the hospital sometime past 10 p.m. The cold biting harder now, the streets slick with rain. Whitby felt different at this hour, emptier. As I walked towards my car, the back of my neck prickled. I wasn't alone. I slowed my footsteps, listening, the distant crash of the waves, the rustle of wind through the alleyways, and then a whisper. Not by words, not anything human, just the faintest brush of sound against the edges of my thoughts, a presence curling in the corners of my mind. I turned sharply, nothing but empty pavement and the dim glow of streetlights. But the feeling didn't fade. My hands clenched at my sides, old instincts flaring to life. Something had followed me, and I knew who it was. I drove aimlessly for a while, letting the town unfold around me like an old map I hadn't read in years. The streets were familiar but changed, edges softened by time. Whitby had always felt like a place caught between centuries, shifting yet stubborn, unwilling to let go of the past. Eventually, I found myself outside a pub I haven't stepped into for over a decade. The windows were fogged from the warmth inside, and the glow of old lights spilling into the wet pavement. I hesitated before pushing open the door. The air inside was thick, with the smell of old wood and stale beer. A handful of locals nursed their drinks, heads turning slightly as I walked in. And then, at the far end of the bar, I saw her. Caitlin. She looked up, eyes narrowing just a fraction before recognition softened them. She hadn't changed much. Still the same dark hair, still the same sharp gaze that always seemed to be sizing up the world around her. "Didn't think I'd see you back here," she said, her voice steady but edged with something unreadable. "Neither did I admitted. She took a sip of her drink, studying me over the rim of her glass. "Long time?" "Yeah, too long." She set her glass down, fingers drumming lightly against the worn wood of the bar. "So what brings you back? Can't imagine it's nostalgia." I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. "My father, he's in the hospital." Something shifted in her expression, the sharpness softening just a fraction. "I heard. Sorry to hear that." I nodded, unsure what else to say. Caitlin wasn't one for empty condolences, and neither was I. Silence stretched between us before she finally spoke again. "This place still gets to you, doesn't it?" I glanced around the bar, the familiar worn edges of it, the way the air felt heavier, like the walls had soaked up too many stories, too many secrets. "Yeah, it does." Her lips pressed together. "You should be careful, Virgil. Not everything that gets left behind stays buried." I frowned at that, but before I could ask what she meant, she stood up, tossing a £20 note onto the bar. "It was good seeing you. Be careful out there." She was gone before I could say anything else, her figure swallowed by the night as she slipped out the door. I stayed behind, finishing my drink in silence. I wasn't sure if it was Caitlin's words or something else, but the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me since I arrived in Whitby had settled deeper. By the time I stepped outside, the streets had emptied, the town settling into the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. The wind cut sharp through the alleyways, thick with the scent of brine and wet stone. My breath curled in the cold, disappearing into the dark, and then a sound. Not quite a whisper, more like a suggestion of one, threading through the wind, curling just at the edges of my hearing. I found myself stopping mid-step, muscles tensing, the night stretching ahead, empty but expectant. The glow of the street lights casting long, fractured shadows. I scanned the pavement, the rooftops, the alley mouths yawning into the deeper black. Nothing moved, no footsteps, no figure shifting, just out of sight. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The sensation slithered down my spine. Something just beyond my reach was watching, waiting. My fingers twitched at my sides, every instinct I had sharpened to a blade's edge. Something was here, and it was paying attention. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, too measured to be the shuffling of some late-night drifter. I looked over my shoulder. I could just about make out the outline of the Whitby docks. I used to spend my youth walking up and down the beach, looking for shark's teeth amongst the sand. Through the gateway I could see the pier, just wooden planks slick with sea spray, the distant glow of the town lights reflecting on the water. No one was there, but the air had changed, thickened. Something unseen was pressing against my skin, making the hair on my arms stand on end. I wasn't alone, I knew as much, but whatever was watching me, whatever had followed me from the shadows of Whitby's narrow streets, wanted me to know it was there. And then the whisper came again, this time closer. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. If you got something to say it. Silence, then barely audible. Virgil. The sound of my name sent ice curling down my spine, not because it was strange to hear, but because the voice that spoke, it wasn't human. It wasn't deep or guttural, it wasn't distorted or monstrous. It was familiar, too familiar. I clenched my fists. No, you're not real. A breath of laughter, barely more than a shifting wind, and then, from the darkness, you left me. I stepped back, heart hammering, my pulse roaring at the ears. I knew that voice. I'd heard it before, years ago, calling my name one last time before the ground swallowed him whole. Marcus, or at least, something wearing his voice. A shape flickered at the edge of my vision, shifting just beyond the reach of the streetlights. Not solid, not quite there. A distortion in the air, as if the night itself was trying to pull itself into a shape it had forgotten how to hold. I exhaled sharply, forcing down the nausea curling in my gut. You're not him. The shadow trembled, wavering between existence and nothingness. Then the whisper again, soft as the tide. Am I not? The shadow flickered again, shifting in and out of focus like a bad signal trying to hold itself. My breath came slower, measured. Whatever this thing was, it was trying to be Marcus, but it wasn't him, it couldn't be. I took a step forward, testing the space between us. The air thickened, resistance pressing against my skin like a static charge. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching, feel the weight of my presence curling around me like a hand at my throat. You left me. The voice came in again, the distortion laced through the familiar cadence, accusing, hollow. My fingers twitched at my sides. I didn't leave you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You fell, you let go. A jolt went through me, like something cold had been poured down my spine. My mind flickered back unbidden to that night. The chanting, the shift in the air, the sudden crack beneath Marcus's feet. The way his fingers had grasped mine, slippery with sweat, before the darkness swallowed him whole. No, I said harsher now, that's not what happened. The shadow pulsed, deepening. The shape of it sharpened into a fraction of a second. Something almost human, almost familiar, before dissolving again and shifting back. You let go, it whispered, right in my ear, though it hadn't moved. I staggered back, a shudder rolling through me. You're not him. You can't be. The thing that wore Marcus's voice laughed then. Aren't I? The docks groaned beneath my feet as a gust of wind tore through the night. The scent of salt thick in the air. The pulses pounded in my ears, but I steadied myself. Whatever this was, it was feeding on something old, something buried deep. I'd spent years trying to forget, but Whitby didn't let you forget. It never had. I forced myself to take another breath. Right, what do you want? The whisper came back again, curling round the edges of the wind. You know what I want. A deep, sickening dread unfurled in my stomach, because maybe, just maybe, I did. The darkness of the doorway seemed to breathe, shifting like ink dissolving in the water. Cold seeped into my bones, deeper than the damp wind rolling on the sea. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. Something was reaching for me from the other side, something vast, unseen, undeniably real. Fingers too long, too thin, curled against the threshold, gripping the edges of the void. My heart still hammering, my body screaming at me to run, but the shadow in front of me, Marcus, or whatever it was pretending to be him, stood firm, watching, waiting. You feel it, don't you? It murmured. The weight of what you left behind. I swallowed, my throat dry. It's not real. It's not fucking real. You still don't understand. The fingers tightened their grip, and the air around me shifted. The world wavered as though it was teetering on the edge of a waking dream. My vision blurred, flashing between the docks of Whitby and something else. Somewhere else. A vast cavern, walls slick with moisture, runes carved into the stones like wounds refusing to close. And beneath it all, the whisper prevailed, calling my name. My fists clenching, my nails biting into my palms. I'm not bringing you back. You don't have a choice. Something always comes through. Fingers clenched at a doorway, a shape behind them shifting, pressing forward. The whisper became a chorus, pleading, demanding, promising. I took a step back, another, my breath ragged. Marcus saw the thing wearing its voice, tilted his head. You think running will save you? My body coiled, ready to bolt. It's not like me, I know, but I came here completely unprepared, and all the stuff with my dad just really put me on edge. And then suddenly, my fingers let go. The doorway convulsed. The darkness rippled forward, a tidal wave of cold rushing towards me, and then everything went black. I woke up to the sensation of damp wood beneath my hands, the scent of salt and mildew thick in my lungs. My eyes snapped open, but the world around me was still shrouded in the night. The docks, I was still on the docks, except the air was wrong, heavier, the sea beyond was motionless, a vast black mirror stretching into infinity. No wind, no sound, just silence pressing in every direction. I pushed myself upright. My limbs felt sluggish, my head was pounding, my body was aching all over, as if I'd been dragged through the depths of the ocean and spat back out on the shore. And then again I saw him. Marcus stood at the edge of the pier, facing the abyss, his silhouette barely visible against the void. You're still here, I rasped, my throat raw. He slowly turned, the movement unnatural, disjointed. His eyes, as if they could still be called that, gleamed with something dark, something hungry. You were always going to come back. I forced myself to my feet, fighting the weight pressing against my chest. What do you want? Not me. It. Beyond him, the void pulsed. The fingers had returned, curling along the edge of the pier, clawing their way into this world. You open the door, Virgil. Now you have to close it. How? The whispering returned, rising like a tide. The runes, the ritual, the incantation. I'd buried it all. I tried to forget, but the past never truly stays buried in Whitby. Marcus took a step towards me. You know how. You just have to be willing. Shadows swelled, the edges of the doorway distorting as if the night itself was being pulled apart. The air churned, thick and heavy, pressing against my skin like an oncoming storm. I could feel it, the last moment slipping away. If I hesitated, the door would never close. The void pulsed, tendrils of darkness coiling outward, stretching hungrily across the dock. The whispers rose, overlapping in a chaotic, pleading wail. They wanted something. They wanted in. And Marcus, if it could even be still called that, stood motionless at the threshold watching. His face wasn't his anymore. Not really, just a poor imitation, stretched too thin over something else. Something just wrong. But the eyes, those were familiar. Hollow and accusing. The reflection of the past I'd spent years trying to outrun. Because Marcus had been my best friend. We were just kids when it happened. 17. Reckless. Obsessed with things we had no business touching. We just thought we were playing at the occult. Holding seances in abandoned buildings. Scribbling sigils from old books we barely understood. It was supposed to be a joke. Until it wasn't. That night we opened something we couldn't close and Marcus, he fell. 1 second he was reaching for my hand, his fingers barely brushing mine. The next, he was gone. Swallowed by the dark, by whatever lay beneath the crack in the world, and I ran. I lied. I let everyone believe he had just disappeared because the truth was much worse. And now the thing wearing his face wanted me to finish what we'd started. My fingers tightened around the lighter in my pocket. The metal was warm from my grip, solid in a way that nothing else in this moment felt. Tell me this ends it. A flicker of something, amusement, sadness across Marcus's burrowed expression. If you finish what you started, it all ends tonight. Finally, I dropped to my knees, pressing the shaking palm into the damp wood. My fingers traced the sigils from memory, carving them into the dock, sealing the edges of the wound we'd torn into the world. My voice cracked as I whispered the incantation, the words scraping against my throat like rusted nails. The void convulsed. The fingers at the edges recoiled, the wind howled through the night, tearing at my clothes and the skin, as if it trying to rip me away from the moment. Marcus shuddered, his form flickering, unravelling at the seams. Hurry, Virgil. His final words left my lips. The world detonated into light. Pain lanced through my skull, my vision fracturing. The world screamed an unearthly sound, neither living nor dead, as it collapsed inward, devouring itself. The fingers clawed at the edges, grasping, desperate, before they, too, were dragged into nothingness. Marcus smiled, just for a moment, a real smile, and then he was gone. And then silence. The dock was empty. The night still. The sea lapped lazily against the shore as if nothing had happened. I fell back, my breath ragged, staring at the stars overhead. The weight had been pressing down on me for years had suddenly lifted, but it had left something behind. An emptiness. Knowing. Because Whitby never forgets. And neither would I. I stayed at the dock for what felt like hours, letting the night press in around me. The wind had now softened, the town distinct and quiet around me. I should have felt relief. Instead, all I felt was tired. Eventually, I brought myself up, my body still aching, limbs still stiff. The ruins I'd drawn were gone, burned away as if they'd never existed. I exhaled, running my hands down my face. Marcus was gone. Truly gone this time, and the door, it had finally closed. I know it had. The thought curled in the back of my mind, uneasy and persistent, but I pushed it down. I needed to move, needed to put one foot in front of the other, and with effort I made my way back to town. The streets were deserted, the streetlights humming faintly, casting long shadows on the pavement. Everything was as it had been. Everything was normal. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Some part of Whitby was watching, still waiting. I wasn't ready to go home. I crawled into the back of my car and slept for what felt like an eternity. And when I woke, it was the following lunchtime. On the way back towards the hospital, I decided to stop again at the pub for one last look, the place where it all started. I pushed open the door and the warmth and hum of conversation washed over me. There she was, again nursing a drink, her gaze lifting the moment she saw me. Something flickered in her eyes. Relief. maybe, or understanding. "You look like hell," she murmured. I let out a short, tired laugh. right back at you. I sat across from her, the weight of the night before pressing down, the ghosts of the past finally quiet. As the afternoon started rolling in, I went to see my father. The hospital room smelt like antiseptic and fading flowers. He was sitting up when I walked in, looking pale but more of himself than before. His eyes sharp despite the exhaustion lining his face, locked onto me the second I stepped through the door. "You staying?" he asked, his voice gruff. I hesitated, glancing at the window and at the grey sky beyond. The answer wasn't as simple as it should have been. "For now," I said. He studied me, then nodded as he already knew. "Whitby always has a way of pulling people back in." I didn't have much of a response for that. Maybe because it was true. As much as I'd planned on leaving as soon as my father was well enough, something kept me rooted. Maybe it was the unfinished business. Maybe it was the guilt. Or maybe it was just that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't running. The house was still mine. The old family shop, abandoned for years, still stood, and Whitby, old and unchanging, waited to see what I would do next. Maybe it was time to stop being just a visitor. Maybe it was time to stay. Weeks passed, and my father, he didn't make it. Complications from the triple bypass, they told me. The words felt clinical, detached, as if reducing the battle of his final days into something explainable, something small. But there was nothing small about watching him fade, his breaths becoming shallower, his voice slipping into silence, his once strong hands now fragile, resting motionless against the hospital sheets. I sat by his bed in those final hours, listening to the quiet hum of machines, the distant murmur of hospital life carrying on the outside of the room. He never asked if I was staying. He already knew the answer. It was in the way he looked at me, something almost satisfied in his gaze, as if he'd always known that this is where it would end up. Whitby had his hold on me now, and in some ways I think I'm glad. The funeral was small, a handful of people who had known him over the years. Old co-workers, distant friends, people I barely remembered from my childhood. The kind of crowd that gathers out of duty rather than grief. The sky was overcast, a grey expanse that passed long over the town, and the air thick with the scent of salt and damp earth. I barely listened to the priest's words. They washed over me, muted and distant, as if I was hearing them from another place entirely. When I was done, the others drifted away in quiet clusters, murmuring their condolences before vanishing into the mist. I stayed behind. I don't know how long I stood there staring into the headstone, tracing my fingers over the rough edges of his name carved into the stone. The man who raised me, who taught me everything I knew about the world, about craftsmanship, about resilience, gone. Now just a name and a marker in the damp ground. Eventually I turned and made my way back to my childhood home. Funny how the world felt heavier now. Guess the house was mine. The shop too. The walls held years of his presence, his tools still neatly arranged, the scent of sawdust and varnish lingering like a ghost of their own. For years I'd run from this place, convinced that leaving was the only way to escape the weight of my past, and now here I was, bound to it in ways I hadn't expected. The nights were worse. I still felt the weight of that night at the docks, the presence, the whispers at the edge of my mind. Sometimes I woke to the sensation of something just beyond my reach, a fleeting shadow curling at the edges of my vision before vanishing. The door had to be closed. That didn't mean something wasn't still watching. But for now, the ghosts were quiet, and I'd nowhere else to be. There's Virgil from the Bethnal Archives. I'll be back when I'm ready, but I will be back.